After you finish listening to the story, don't forget to leave a comment about what you would have done in the character's place. Now, let's dive into the story. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, horns blaring, people rushing, and the faint hum of street performers trying to make a living. Richard walked briskly through the crowded sidewalk, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement. He was a man of routine, his days meticulously planned: wake up at 6 a.m., hit the gym by 6:30, shower, dress, and be at his office by 8:15 sharp. Today was no different, or so he thought. Richard was a successful financial analyst, a man who prided himself on his ability to predict market trends and make sound decisions. His life was orderly, predictable, and, if he was being honest with himself, a little lonely. At 38, he had achieved most of what he had set out to do: corner office, a sleek apartment overlooking the city, and a portfolio that would make most people envious. But there was a void, one he couldn't quite fill with spreadsheets and stock options. As he turned the corner onto Fifth Avenue, he saw her. She was sitting on a worn-out blanket, her back against the cold brick wall of a closed-down bookstore. Her clothes were tattered, her hair matted, and her face bore the marks of a life lived on the streets. But there was something about her eyes, deep, soulful, and piercing, that stopped Richard in his tracks. He had seen countless homeless people before, but something about her felt different. Maybe it was the way she held herself, with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in her circumstances. Richard hesitated. He wasn't the type to give money to panhandlers. He had read enough articles about how it could enable bad habits, how it was better to donate to shelters or charities. But today, something inside him shifted. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and crouched down to hand it to her. "Here," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Get yourself something to eat." She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to figure him out. Then, to his surprise, she shook her head. "I don't need your money," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet defiance. Richard blinked, taken aback. I just thought." "I know what you thought," she interrupted, her tone not unkind but firm. "You thought you'd toss a few dollars my way and feel better about yourself. But I don't need your pity." Richard straightened up, feeling a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said carefully. "I just wanted to help." She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Help doesn't always come in the form of money," she said. "Sometimes it's just seeing someone as a person. Not a problem to be solved." Richard was silent for a moment, her words sinking in. He had never thought of it that way. To him, homelessness was a societal issue, something to be addressed through policy and philanthropy. But here was a real person, sitting in front of him, challenging his assumptions. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. She hesitated, then said, "Sarah." "With one R." "Sarah," Richard repeated. "I'm Richard." She nodded but didn't say anything else. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Richard glanced at his watch. He was already running late for his morning meeting, but something about this encounter made him reluctant to leave. "Look," he said, "I don't know what your situation is, but if there's anything I can do to help, really help, let me know." Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked simply. Richard opened his mouth to respond but found he didn't have an answer. Why was he offering to help her? Was it guilt? Curiosity? Or something deeper, something he hadn't fully acknowledged yet? "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd like to try." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "But on one condition." "What's that?" Richard asked. "You don't try to fix me," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not a project. I'm a person." Richard nodded, feeling a strange sense of respect for her. Deal. And with that, an unlikely connection was formed. Richard didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter would change the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. Richard's life began to shift in subtle ways after that morning. He found himself thinking about Sarah more often than he expected. Her words lingered in his mind, challenging the way he viewed the world and himself. He started taking a different route to work, one that passed by the corner where she usually Saturday. Sometimes he'd stop to talk, other times he'd just nod and leave a small bag of groceries or a warm coffee. Sarah never asked for anything, but she accepted his gestures with a quiet gratitude that felt genuine. Their conversations were brief at first, but over time, they grew deeper. Richard learned that Sarah had once been a teacher, a fact that surprised him. She had a degree in literature and had taught high school English for nearly a decade before her life took a turn she never saw coming. She didn't go into details, but Richard sensed there was more to her story than she was willing to share. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Richard found himself sitting on the sidewalk beside Sarah, a rare moment of stillness in his otherwise hectic life. The city buzzed around them, but for the first time in years, Richard felt present, grounded. "Why did you stop teaching?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Sarah hesitated, her gaze fixed on the passing cars. "It's a long story," she said finally. "I've got time," Richard replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I lost everything," she said quietly. "My job, my apartment, my family. It wasn't just one thing. It was a series of bad decisions, bad luck, and a system that doesn't care much about people who fall through the cracks." Richard listened, his chest tightening. He had always thought of homelessness as something that happened to other people, those who made poor choices or didn't work hard enough. But Sarah didn't fit that narrative. She was articulate, intelligent, and resilient. Her story forced him to confront his own biases. "I'm sorry," he said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. Sarah shrugged, a small, bitter smile playing on her lips. "Don't be. It is what it is. I've made my peace with it." But Richard couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, he found himself doing more than just dropping off food or coffee. He started researching shelters, job programs, and resources that could help Sarah get back on her feet. He even offered to let her stay in his guest room temporarily, but she refused. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "But I'm not a charity case, Richard. I need to do this on my own terms." Richard respected her boundaries, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. Then, one rainy afternoon, everything changed. Richard was walking home from work, his umbrella shielding him from the downpour, when he saw Sarah arguing with a man near her usual spot. The man was tall, well-dressed, and looked out of place in the gritty alley. Richard couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension between them was palpable. As he approached, the man grabbed Sarah's arm, his voice rising. "You can't keep running from this," the man snapped. Sarah yanked her arm free, her face a mask of anger and fear. "I'm not running. I'm surviving. There's a difference." Richard quickened his pace, his protective instincts kicking in. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The man turned to him, his expression a mix of annoyance and surprise. "This doesn't concern you," he said dismissively. "It does if she's in trouble," Richard shot back, stepping closer to Sarah. Sarah looked at Richard, her eyes wide with something he couldn't quite place, gratitude, maybe, or fear. "It's fine, Richard," she said quickly. "This is personal." The man scoffed, adjusting his coat. "Personal? Sarah, this is bigger than you. You can't just disappear and expect everyone to forget." Richard's mind raced. Who was this man? And what was he talking about? Before he could ask, Sarah turned to him, her voice low and urgent. "I need to go," she said. "I'll explain later, I promise." And with that, she grabbed her few belongings and hurried down the alley, disappearing into the rain. The man watched her go, his expression unreadable, then turned to Richard. "You should stay out of this," he said coldly before walking away. Richard stood there, soaked and confused, his mind spinning with questions. Who was Sarah, really? And what had she been running from? The next few days were agonizing. Sarah didn't return to her usual spot, and Richard had no way of contacting her. He felt a strange emptiness, as if a part of him had been ripped away. He tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. Finally, unable to stand the uncertainty any longer, Richard decided to dig deeper. He started by searching online for any mention of Sarah, but her name was too common to yield useful results. Then he remembered the man who had confronted her. He didn't know his name, but he had a face, and in a city full of cameras, that was something. Richard used his connections to pull security footage from the area where the confrontation had taken place. It took some doing, but eventually, he had a clear image of the man. He ran it through a facial recognition program and waited. The results were shocking. The man was Daniel Hartman, a high-profile attorney known for representing some of the city's wealthiest and most powerful clients. What was a man like that doing confronting Sarah on the streets? Richard's curiosity turned into determination. He needed answers. He tracked down Hartman's office and, after some persuasion, managed to secure a meeting. When he walked into the sleek, modern office, Hartman looked up from his desk, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Mr. Thompson," Hartman said, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Richard didn't mince words. "I want to know who Sarah is and why you were harassing her." Hartman's eyes narrowed, but he didn't seem surprised. "Harassing her? That's a strong word. I was simply trying to reason with her." "Reason with her about what?" Richard pressed. Hartman studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, Mr. Thompson, this is a complicated situation. Sarah. Well, let's just say she's not who you think she is." Richard's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Hartman leaned forward, his tone serious. "Sarah isn't just some homeless woman. She's the daughter of one of the most powerful men in this city. A man who would prefer to keep her situation out of the public eye." Richard's mind reeled. Sarah, the daughter of a powerful figure. It didn't make sense. If that's true, why is she living on the streets? Hartman's expression darkened. Because she chose to. She walked away from everything, her family, her inheritance, her life. And now, she's become a liability. Richard's heart pounded. A liability to who? Hartman didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "My advice, Mr. Thompson. Stay out of this. For your own good." But Richard couldn't let it go. He left Hartman's office more determined than ever to find Sarah and uncover the truth. What he didn't know was that the truth would be far more dangerous and far more life-changing than he could have ever imagined. Richard's mind was a whirlwind as he left Hartman's office. The revelation that Sarah was connected to one of the city's most powerful families was staggering. It explained so much: her intelligence, her resilience, the way she carried herself despite her circumstances. But it also raised more questions than it answered. Why would someone with her background choose to live on the streets? And why was her family so determined to keep her hidden? He needed to find Sarah. But with no leads and no way to contact her, he felt like he was chasing a ghost. He decided to start with the last place he'd seen her, the alley where she'd argued with Hartman. Maybe someone had seen her, or maybe she'd left something behind that could point him in the right direction. The alley was as grim as he remembered, the rain from the other day leaving puddles that reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. Richard walked slowly, scanning the area for any sign of Sarah. He noticed a small, tattered notebook half hidden under a dumpster. His heart leapt as he picked it up. It was hers. He recognized the worn cover from the times he'd seen her writing in it. He flipped through the pages, careful not to damage them. The notebook was filled with poetry, sketches, and fragments of thoughts. Some pages were smudged with rain or dirt, but the words were still legible. They were raw and beautiful, a window into Sarah's soul. One passage caught his eye. They think I've lost everything, but they are wrong. I've gained something they'll never understand, freedom. Freedom from their expectations, their control, their lies. But freedom comes at a cost, and I'm not sure how much longer I can pay it. Richard's chest tightened. He felt a surge of protectiveness toward Sarah, a determination to help her no matter what it took. But first, he needed to understand what she was running from. Richard spent the next few days piecing together what he could about Sarah's family. Hartman had mentioned she was the daughter of a powerful man, but he hadn't named names. Richard started digging into the city's elite, looking for any connection to Sarah. It wasn't easy. These were people who guarded their privacy fiercely, but eventually, a name emerged: Victor Langston. Victor Langston was a billionaire real estate mogul, a man whose influence reached into every corner of the city. He was known for his ruthless business tactics and his equally ruthless personal life. Rumors swirled about his family, but little was confirmed. Richard's research turned up a single photo of Langston with his daughter, taken years ago at a charity gala. The girl in the photo was young, but there was no mistaking her. It was Sarah. Richard's stomach churned. If Sarah was Victor Langston's daughter, why was she living on the streets? And why was her family so desperate to keep her hidden? He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. He reached out to Langston's office, using his position as a financial analyst to request a meeting. To his surprise, he was granted an appointment the following day. The Langston estate was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls and security cameras. Richard felt out of place as he walked up the grand driveway, his shoes crunching on the gravel. A butler greeted him at the door and led him to a study where Victor Langston was waiting. Langston was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with sharp features and piercing eyes. He looked every bit the powerful man Richard had read about. "Mr. Thompson," Langston said, his voice cool and measured. "I understand you've taken an interest in my daughter." Richard swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. "I have. I'm concerned about her well-being." Langston's expression darkened. "Sarah's well-being is none of your concern. She made her choices, and now she has to live with them." Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "With all due respect, sir, she's living on the streets. That's not a choice anyone should have to make." Langston's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't know that? I've tried to help her, but she refuses to listen. She's stubborn, just like her mother." Richard sensed there was more to the story. "What happened?" he asked gently. Langston sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Sarah's mother died when she was young. After that, Sarah changed. She became rebellious, distant. She blamed me for her mother's death, though I had nothing to do with it. When she turned 18, she left. Cut off all contact. I've tried to reach out, but she won't have anything to do with me." Richard frowned. "And the man who confronted her? Daniel Hartman?" Langston's expression hardened. "Hartman works for me. I sent him to try to reason with her, to bring her home. But she won't listen." Richard felt a pang of sympathy for Langston, but something still didn't add up. "If you want to help her, why not do it quietly? Why the confrontation?" Langston hesitated, then said, because Sarah knows things. Things that could damage this family's reputation. I can't risk her talking to the wrong people. Richard's stomach dropped. What kind of things? Langston's eyes bore into his. That's none of your business, Mr. Thompson. All you need to know is that Sarah is a danger to herself and to this family. If you care about her, you'll stay out of this. Richard left the estate feeling more confused than ever. Langston's story painted Sarah as a troubled young woman who had turned her back on her family, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. And then there was Langston's cryptic warning about Sarah knowing things that could damage the family. What was he hiding? Richard decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to find Sarah himself, he reached out to a local outreach program that worked with the homeless community. He explained Sarah's situation without revealing her identity and asked if they could help locate her. A few days later, he got a call. Sarah had been spotted at a shelter on the other side of the city. Richard rushed over, his heart pounding. When he arrived, he found Sarah sitting on a cot, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening in surprise. "Richard," she said softly. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," he replied, sitting down beside her. "I was worried." Sarah looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You shouldn't be." "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Richard said gently. "And you don't have to do this alone. I want to help you, Sarah. But I need to understand what's going on." Sarah was silent for a long moment, then sighed. "It's complicated." "I've got time," Richard said, echoing their earlier conversation. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "All right," she said finally. "But you're not going to like what you hear." And with that, she began to tell her story, a story of betrayal, secrets, and a family that would do anything to protect its name. As Richard listened, he realized that helping Sarah would mean confronting forces far more powerful than he had ever imagined. But he also knew that he couldn't turn away. Not now. Not after everything. Sarah's voice was steady but laced with pain as she began to unravel the story she had kept buried for so long. Richard listened intently, his heart heavy with each word. "My father," Sarah began, "isn't just a powerful man. He's a dangerous one. He built his empire on lies, manipulation, and the suffering of others. When I was younger, I didn't see it. I thought he was a hero, a self-made man who had overcome the odds. But as I got older, I started to notice things that didn't add up." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "My mother. She wasn't just sick. She was poisoned. I didn't know it at the time, but she had discovered something about my father's business dealings, something so damning that he couldn't let her live. She tried to expose him, and he made sure she never got the chance." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "Are you saying your father killed your mother?" Sarah nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want to believe it at first. But the more I dug, the more evidence I found. My father's empire is built on corruption, fraud, and even worse. He's involved in things I can't even bring myself to say out loud." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "And tell them what?" "That Victor Langston, one of the most powerful men in the city, is a criminal. Without proof, I'd be dismissed as a delusional daughter with a grudge. And even if I did have proof, my father has the police, the courts, and half the city in his pocket. He'd destroy me before I could even file a report." Richard's mind raced. "So you ran?" "I had no choice," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't live under his roof, knowing what he'd done. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. So I left. I thought if I disappeared, he'd let me go. But he didn't. He sent Hartman after me, trying to bring me back. He's afraid I'll talk, that I'll expose him. And he's right to be afraid. Richard reached out, placing a hand on hers. Sarah, you don't have to do this alone. We can fight him together. We can find a way to bring him to justice. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his. You don't understand, Richard. My father doesn't play by the rules. If he finds out you're involved, he'll come after you too. I can't ask you to risk your life for me. Richard shook his head. You're not asking. I'm offering. I can't just walk away, not after everything you've told me. We'll find a way to take him down. Together. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Sarah worked tirelessly to gather evidence against Victor Langston. It wasn't easy. Langston's empire was built on layers of secrecy and deception, but they were determined. Richard used his connections in the financial world to trace Langston's illicit dealings, while Sarah provided insider knowledge of her father's operations. They uncovered a web of corruption that stretched far beyond what either of them had imagined. Money laundering, bribery, even ties to organized crime. Langston's hands were dirty in ways that made Richard's stomach turn. But the most damning evidence was the proof Sarah had of her mother's murder. It was a risk to keep it, but Sarah had hidden it away years ago, knowing that one day it might be her only leverage. As they pieced together their case, Richard and Sarah grew closer. What had started as a chance encounter had blossomed into something deeper, a partnership built on trust, respect, and a shared determination to right the wrongs of the past. But they knew they were running out of time. Langston was no fool, and it was only a matter of time before he realized what they were up to. They needed to act fast. The day of reckoning came sooner than they expected. Richard and Sarah were finalizing their evidence when they received a message from an anonymous source. Langston knew about their plan and was coming for them. They had no choice but to go public. Richard reached out to a trusted journalist, someone he knew wouldn't be swayed by Langston's influence. Together, they prepared to expose the truth. But Langston wasn't going down without a fight. As Richard and Sarah made their way to the journalist's office, they were ambushed. A black SUV pulled up beside them, and before they could react, they were dragged inside. When they came to, they were in a dimly lit warehouse, bound to chairs. Langston stood before them, his expression cold and calculating. You should have stayed out of this, Mr. Thompson, Langston said, his voice dripping with disdain. And you, Sarah. I gave you every chance to come back. But you just couldn't let it go, could you? Sarah glared at him, her eyes blazing with defiance. You killed my mother. You destroyed countless lives. I won't let you get away with it. Langston smirked. And how do you plan to stop me? You're in no position to make demands. But Sarah had one last card to play. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady. The evidence is already out there. By now, the police and the media have everything they need to bring you down. Langston's smirk faltered. You're bluffing. Am I? Sarah shot back. Check your phone. Langston hesitated, then pulled out his phone. His face paled as he saw the notifications, news alerts, messages from his lawyers, calls from his contacts. The truth was out, and there was no stopping it. For the first time, Richard saw fear in Langston's eyes. The mighty Victor Langston, brought to his knees by the daughter he had tried to control. In the days that followed, the city was rocked by the scandal. Victor Langston was arrested, his empire crumbling under the weight of the evidence against him. The media dubbed it the fall of the Titan, and Sarah became a symbol of courage and resilience. Richard stood by her side through it all, their bond stronger than ever. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But the journey wasn't over. Sarah still had to rebuild her life, to find her place in a world that had been turned upside down. And Richard had to decide what came next, for his career, for his future, and for the woman who had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. As they stood together, watching the sunrise over the city, Sarah turned to Richard and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. "For believing in me. For standing by me." Richard took her hand, his heart full. "Always," he said. "No matter what comes next, we'll face it together." And in that moment, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would overcome them, not as two people bound by circumstance, but as partners. United by love and a shared determination to build a better future. Months later, Sarah and Richard stood on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by reporters and supporters. Sarah had become an advocate for the homeless, using her story to shine a light on the systemic issues that had led to her own struggles. Richard had left his job in finance, dedicating himself to helping Sarah in her mission. As they addressed the crowd, their voices rang out with hope and determination. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their love a beacon of light in a world that often felt too heavy to bear. And as they walked away, hand in hand, they knew that their story was just beginning, a story of redemption, resilience, and the power of love to overcome even the greatest of odds.